it's not going to be damaged, and it feels more clean and, natural. Because if it feels damaged, there will be, guess what, a change in the shape, right? Let me grab a reference here so we can speak better about it. I don't want to be the owner of this car, by the way, but it's basically what happens sometimes. So if the metal is going to be damaged, okay, guess what? There's going to be a change in perspective. And that change in perspective will be causing the shape to have a change in the direction. And even the lighting and the shadow will be reacting in a different way. But it's very important that you actually understand that the change in direction is critical. So when you look at the surface, your eye should be trained enough to distinguish this kind of a change in the shape and direction. Does it make sense? What I'm saying? So that's why when you're dealing with a hard edge surface that has a big change in the shape, the kind of emphasis and the result of the contrast of the light and shadow will be more enhanced and pushed, because this one will create, this change of shape will create a change in angle. And if you remember what we said during the first lesson, whenever you have a plane changing, you're going to be having a volume change as well. Same thing will be if you have something that, since this is a hard edge, has a very drastic change in the angle in perspective, you're going to be noticing a very harsh change in the volume, and even the edge work will be quite hard. So you have to keep in mind that. But again, if it is a polished metal, your highlights, they're going to be quite graphic and bold, like I'm trying to represent in this shape here. In that case, you can have a transition like that feels much more bolder. Even here, graphic. Mostly because you have something that feels more hard edge, and the plane changing is quite drastic. Okay, so that's basically the kind of a surface thinking element, sorry, that you have to think about when looking at a metal surface. The second one would be aging. And this component, and by the way, it's all good, guys, so far. Let me know if you have any question or concern about what I'm saying, if I have to re-explain or whatever. Second element would be aging. This element is important because it's also helping us to deliver some kind of a storytelling, if we have to, because when you actually expose metal to weathering or through time, it could happen that aging is transforming and affecting the surface of metal itself. So you see that aging is actually changing the kind of the surface, or it could be affecting the surface of the metal itself. So it's depending a little bit on the kind of a surface, and it's actually affecting it. So what it could happen in certain circumstances with the metal is rust could be growing over the surface. And right now, if we make again our like surface in a microscope way, like the side here, and we know that, oh, by the way, I forgot to mention before that in some cases, like with cars, like the car that we have seen before, you could have some kind of a spray paint applied over the surface. Like could be a blue color like that. But remember that the original color of the metal surface is going to be underneath the spray paint color. So if there's going to be any scratching or any kind of a damage, it could happen that you notice and you see the original color being revealed. And that's why if we bring up again this reference, you actually see that there are bits of the car that are more in the grayish color. This is the original color of the facelift of the car. Okay. Now you see that there are scratches as well, and those are basically revealing the underneath real color. There is just like a spray paint color applied over the surface of metal. So if we are scratching it, we see that there's the original color. Okay. But now we were talking about rust and weathering effect to the metal. Sometimes it can happen that rust is growing over the surface. So it's not like we are having, less amount of the shape here. It's actually having another organic material that is actually growing over the kind of a surface. It's actually growing over, making the surface of the metal irregular now and making it feel like it is being affected by another thing. And what this will be causing to the surface is a loss in the reflectivity for sure. Why I'm saying that? Because the kind of irregular shape of the rust forming over the surface will be creating this irregular shape that we do not see anymore the kind of a lighting, because it is not anymore like a smooth, polished surface that is highly reflecting the light. Now the light is hitting the surface in a regular way, so we do not see anymore a clean, bold, graphic shape for the lighting. Okay. Now, it could happen also that you could have rust growing only in certain parts. If you have scratch or whatever, it will be appearing only in those scratches or holes or parts that are going to be damaged, and not on the entire surface of the metal. That happens because, in some cases, or I should say nowadays, most of the metal surfaces, they're going to be having a treatment on the surface that is not letting weathering to affect the surface itself. But of course, if the car is going to be damaged or the metal surface is going to be damaged, you see revealed the underneath surface, which can be, of course, subject to rust and affected by rust. Okay. In terms of color, rust usually has this kind of saturated yellow orange, in some cases even red brown kind of a color. And my suggestion, if you have to deal with it and you have to make it like in a painting, would be for sure to start with the color of your metal surface. Like let's say if we have this blue sphere, and let's say that we have the light coming from this angle, maybe this other angle here, okay? And there is some kind of a reflection over there. So this is my polished metal out of the factory, super shiny. And then there's the highlight reflections over there, which can be pretty bold and graphic, because it is polished, right? Maybe it could be even something more like this. And, what I was mentioning before is if we have like a scratch or something, let's say that my metal surface got a scratch like this, or even bigger like that, then there's like a change in the plane because there was a scratch, so we see more of the stuff being revealed underneath. And then this is also exposed to the light over there. And if we do not repair this scratch, it could happen through time, of course, not in the immediate, that you can actually see some kind of a rust growing. And my suggestion would be to involve some kind of a texture brush to give that sort of a rusted look, and rust being growing over the surface. Okay, and following, of course, the shape of the sphere. So maybe it is following the rounder shape of the sphere over there. Or could even happen with a lot of time, and maybe this is going to be exposed a lot to the weathering time, that rust is growing all over the place. Let's see if I can, yes, I can. And what is happening is that my surface, it's now losing the lighting reflections happening over the surface here, and we see less of the reflectivity and more of this stuff growing over the surface. And again, you can actually use some texture brush if you want to give that sort of a dirty kind of look here. But it is important to start with your original local color, and then you apply later your rust growing over the surface. Because by doing that, you will be maintaining the kind of initial color that could still be visible underneath the rust layer over there. And you can even manage to emphasize and push more, even maybe with a multiply layer, the kind of shapes of rust that maybe are growing even more and making like layers and having even more depth and contrast with the original layer of the metal itself. Okay? And you should not place some kind of highlight here, because that's not possible. There could be some kind of a reflections of the sky for sure happening here. Like maybe some kind of a skylight reflection happening on the rust surface. But other than that, you will never see some kind of bold graphic highlight affecting the rust surface. Okay, does it make sense? Oops. And that was the aging. So the aging is due to the kind of a quality of the surface. If the surface is going to be polished, if the surface is going to be damaged or not, if the surface is going to be smooth or rough. In this case, it's going to be rough when the rust is going to be growing over the surface of metal. Now, the third element that we have to consider when we're dealing with the metal surface is, of course, reflectivity. Now, when I'm talking about reflectivity, I'm of course referring to the quality of surface and of course to the aging as well, because there should be any aging if we want to have reflectivity being placed over the surface. Because if there is any kind of a surface, any kind of a rust growing here or dust or dirty stuff over the surface, we won't be able to recognize what's happening in the reflections. But this is something that will happen when you mostly have smooth surfaces. When you have smooth surface, okay, you will notice a lot of those reflections. And now we have to introduce another thing that it's still in the reflectivity, but we have to make a little bit of a digression into perspective and how much important again is to take care and notice and analyze what kind of shape am I looking at. Because if I'm looking at this object here, which is made of steel, which is highly reflected because it's manufactured, it's not like it is not like a metal or mineral that is rough, like iron or something that has more irregular surface. Steel is quite smooth because it's manufactured. There's been like a manufactured process brushing the metal to a level that it feels smooth, right? And mostly flat. But there could be also having a shape and presenting mirroring reflections. And by mirroring reflections, I mean that it is exactly working as a mirror. So it is reflecting one-on-one what is happening nearby. Like you can see in this example, you can see many reflections. But there is also one reflection that I want to mirroring reflection that I want you to focus on and notice how weird it starts to look at, which is the reflection, the mirroring reflection of the guy who is taking the picture. And one curious thing is that you can see this guy being repeated multiple times. But every reflection of that guy is actually different. And could you actually tell me why each one of those reflections is different from each other? What is the component that makes them so different? But it's still the same guy being reflected on the surface. What is making this looking so weird? Anyone?
Is it like the direction of the surface?
The direction of the surface. So let me check the. And I think I get it. Arsabi is saying the angle from the surface. Yes, you are right, guys. It is basically due to the perspective, of course, but also to how the shape is, changing in direction. And that's why it's so important to understand that. And if we see this object, we notice that we can actually divide into three major angles, like this one. Then there's this curve over there, and then there's this final one, which is the flat one. Is actually parallel to the ground, basically. Okay, so in a side view kind of a thing, we will actually see something straight like this. Then we will see like a small curve like this, and then we will actually see this flat surface parallel on the ground. And now you can think about if there's like an object here, okay, that is gonna be reflected this surface, in this surface, and in this other surface. It is not gonna be reflected the same way. Why? Because of the angle of the surface that is changing. And even more, when you have an angle, when you have a surface that is actually curving, you're gonna be having even more distortion. Because if you think about it, if you have like a mirror, and usually mirrors, they are flat, right? So that if there's like a person here, let's say that there's this guy over there, this guy will be reflected one-on-one on the mirror here, right? You will actually see the exact kind of one-on-one reflection of the person. But what happens if I take this glass and instead of being like a, how can I say, flat surface, is gonna be more like a complex shape, something more like this, more crazy? Do you think that we are gonna be having the same kind of a reflection? Not at all. But the face of the head of this guy will be affected by the crazy change in the shape of the glass here. So it is going to be super tricky to create that. But keep in mind that there will be distortions happening in the surface, which is basically what is going to be happening here in this metal object. Because here you can see that this guy who's taking the picture has one perspective when we see him in this angle, which is flat. So it's a little bit less, how can I say, distorted, okay? Because it is quite similar to the perspective of the person where the person is standing. Then we have this one, which is curving. And here we see more compression and we see like his face, his head is getting squeezed, right? And the overall body as well is getting squeezed and more, narrower. It basically looks more weird. And then again, over there, because there is like a tiny change as well over there, but I want to take this in consideration for now. And then we have this other one, which is a flat surface. So basically, we're going to be seeing more of the hands of the person and less of the face. But why the head is going to be in the face is going to be more squeezed is because of the perspective, right? It is more like if a person is taking a shot, of course, since this flat surface, it's more below the hands, there's going to be some kind of distortion happening over there. The same thing will be with the light shapes, even the lights. And you can see that this shape and this shape of the lights, they're going to be the same, but they are subject to change in order of how much the surface in terms of the angle is going to be changing. Directly the shapes of the light are going to be changing as well. They're going to be distorted or less distorted. okay? So that's critical to understand as well. It can sound quite complex, so take your time to understand what is happening. And I mean, if you are painting from references, both from life or from a photograph like this example, you can actually trust your hand-eye coordination and try to get a similar result. Let's say if you're doing something from your imagination, okay, and you're painting a metal surface that is highly reflective and having some mirroring reflective as reflections as well, how you're going to be placing those reflections over the surface. You need to be able to understand how to place those correctly over the surface and not just guessing them where they could be applied, but understanding that there could be distortion that are appearing over the surface, right? And even that kind of weird stuff that is happening over there, it's always due to the kind of a form and shape of the metal itself. Because the metal here is curving, so all the reflections, they are going to be distorted, right? And even the kind of metal surface, it is not like a, even though it's a smooth surface, but it's not like 100% flat. There's still some kind of a irregular pattern that is happening that it's giving that kind of reflections happening, right? Usually this sort of a chrome effect you see here can be quite tricky to paint. You just have to be patient, observe how much distortion and how the distortions are working in the surface in the perspective in order to get a believable kind of a feeling of it. If you treat the reflections the same way, if you have an object that is changing the shape and perspective, you're not doing a favor to yourself, right? You're just making an issue that later on it will be looking like it's fake, right? So those are the three major components of metal: surface, aging, and reflectivity. If you think about those three when you're dealing with metal, you're starting well because you are already questioning yourself about what kind of surface am I looking at? It is smooth or rough? It is subject to aging, yes or no? And then how much reflectivity should be appearing over the surface? All those three elements are working together in order to make believable the metal material. We spoke about the surface, regular, rough versus flat smooth, so I will skip this for time's sake. And now I wanna focus a little bit onto those two references, mostly on the reference that is actually on the left here. This jet airplane has a red kind of a varnish applied over his original metal surface. But it's also something that is happening in terms of color, which is quite interesting. And you can notice that here, which is the influence of the sky color being applied over the surface of the metal. If you remember what we were saying, try to do this over there. If you remember what we were saying during the color lesson, and I hope you do remember, we have our red matte surface over there, right? And then we expose it to the white light. Here we keep a little bit of the saturated edge. Then maybe here there could be some reflections of the ground and whatever. Now, what happens if we have like influence of the skylight coming from the left? What we say is that we have to take our color and we have to go from the hue of the original color towards something that feels more close to the color of the light source, which in this case, the secondary light source is the skylight, so it's a blue color. So we take the red color and we go more towards the cooler version of the red, but we do not go beyond the red hue territory. You remember that? And by doing that, we're actually applying some of these influences of the sky color over the surface of my red color here. And we're doing this to communicate that there's like a changing in the hue because we are actually exposing our red sphere in this case to two different lights. One light that is actually the key light coming from the right, and one secondary light that comes from the top left in this case, which is affecting more this part. Usually in a matte surface, we have like this sort of a changing, but we do not have like a blue color that is actually affecting this part. But look at what's happening here with this jet airplane. If we go here and we use our color picker nearby the blue color, we see that this is actually blue color. We are in the blue hue. Then if we move away, it feels like going back. Look at that. Moving back to the original red color. See that? So you could actually ask me and say, wait a second, why this object is actually showing, even though it is a red color, but it's showing a blue color affecting the surface? Because this is a metal surface. And the metal surface in terms of reflectivity is actually higher, almost specular. And that's why we have the mirroring happening over the surface. Than actually a matte surface, which is actually being affected, but in a much more softer way from the light. So it's not like drastically changing the kind of change in the color on the surface. So in a kind of situation where the sphere was made of a red metal object surface, first of all, we will have a little bit more of higher light affecting the surface over there. And then the skylight color will be completely affecting and being mirrored over the surface of the sphere. Does it make sense? So that's why in some cases you could actually go beyond your original color to communicate what is going to be happening. Because mostly of the reflectivity, if the reflectivity is higher, then you have to show more of those colors being reflected over the surface. Does it make sense? Maybe here there could be some kind of lines. Does it make sense, guys? What I'm saying, more or less. And there is also one other thing to say about this, which is related to the mirroring reflections. So we spoke about the color, but now there is something happening also in the kind of a mirroring reflections. If we look closely to this, we see that this is actually displaying some of the environment that is happening, but also reflecting the kind of a turbine of the jet itself. A look of what is happening here. And this is a good example if we have to think about and talk about distortion. The kind of a shape of this turbine being reflected is actually looking like this. So it kind of looks like squeezed a little bit. And more larger on the horizon line. And why this is happening? You can guess because of course, of the shape, right? And that's correct. Because if we had like a flat surface like this, okay? So in a normal situation with a normal mirror, we will be having this kind of turbine being reflected one-on-one in terms of the shape, in terms of the details of it. So it will be like the same kind of reflection one-on-one happening in terms of proportion. But this surface, it is not so flat and straight. It's curved. Again, this is why it's so important to understand the shapes and draw and paint them correctly. Because here you see that there is a curve happening. So there's a distortion in my perspective that is involving the actual shape reflected to distort and to appear as something that it looks different. It is because of the angle of the surface itself, right? And the more the shape is going to be weird and having changes in the direction, the more this compression is going to be higher. And you can actually see that in this small turbine here, over there, there is also some reflections happening of this white building that we see beyond the jet airplane. But even here, you see that the building is a crazy, weird perspective, almost feels like a fisheye, right? And why this is happening again? Because of the rounder shape of the turbine. And then there is also another change in direction here. So you can see that perspective is making a crazy job here. It's making this reflection appearing at something more like a fisheye. Because again, it's more like due to the surface where the reflection is going to be applied. Okay? Or you can even think about the road, how the road is actually distorted here. Like you can see that is making this sort of a weird curved sort of a shape. It is mostly an elongated. Just look at the building, how much elongated it looks like. Again, this is all due to the perspective. And again, you can solve this by just looking at the reference and trying to replicating one-on-one. But if you have to do this from your imagination or even giving the impression of it, it's hard because you have to understand how the surface is going to be changing in the angle. So keep in mind those things because they're going to be critical to achieve that sort of a polished look for this airplane. And even the color, before we move on, of course, is going to be affected by the color of the metal itself. That's why the white building in the background that is actually reflected here, of course, is not this part, is the part that is not visible in the image, but the color of it is still in the white territory. That's why here it's more like on the pink, light red territory, because it's going to be affected, of course, by the surface of the jet airplane over there. Okay. On the opposite, if we look at this car, which has a matte varnish of the surface of the metal, you see that here things are just pretty similar to the matte surface. So there is not like a huge impact of the sky color over the surface, over the dark gray surface over there. But there's some kind of a hints of this kind of a sky color. But you see that we do not go in the territory of the sky. So we do not have something like this, like we could have in a situation where we have more specular reflections of the metal. This metal feels more matte surface. So it's more softer. You can actually compare it with the glass here, which is more highly reflective, or even that part that feels more like steel. You can actually see that it's highly reflective and more close to mirroring. Okay? So that's something to keep in mind as well. It's not like if it's metal, it's going to be 100% reflective and polished. There could be also some kind of a matte surface happening as well. Now there could be more metals. I want you to show those spheres by comparing the iron with the rusted iron. So we have a poor reflectivity. In the iron, we still have the highlight visible, even though usually iron has a rough kind of a quality to the surface. So that's why maybe the highlight is going to be graphic for sure, but maybe with the lighting spreading a little bit more in a irregular way. And of course, with the rusted version, the reflectivity is going to be very poor. So we do not have any trace of highlight, but we're just having some kind of a rust growing over the surface. And if we think about gold, and we're going to be seeing some real life examples in a moment, you can actually experience also gold polished as we mostly know it, but also aged gold. And the difference will be with gold, usually you can see the highlight, you can see the specular reflections of whatever is going to be nearby. You see many more reflections. The reflectivity is going to be pretty high because the surface is polished and of course flat, so you can actually see what's happening in the surrounding. Keep in mind the gold, usually the gold that we know is of course manufactured. So they basically extract the mineral of gold. They work it, they polish it, and they basically put in a kind of a process where you actually then see the kind of a polished gold that we all know that is highly reflective, but originally is not so polished, right? And then the aged gold, what happens with aged gold is basically we have a loss in the reflectivity. There is no rust growing over, but there is mostly reflectivity, losing reflectivity quite a bit. And then we have much more warmer and darker color. It doesn't feel so bright like originally. And it doesn't feel so smooth and clean. And again, graphic in the highlight. It feels a little bit more textured and more rough. And we can see actually some examples here. The ones on the right, they are actually polished gold. The ones that are actually on the left, the one that is actually on the left, this is more like aged gold. In the aged gold, you see that everything feels more rough, more texture. There are, scratches, and even the color of the gold feels a little bit more darker, in some cases even more desaturated. It doesn't feel bright. And so, I don't want to say saturated, because even this one could be saturated in some cases, but less. This one feels more vibrant, and the aged gold feels less vibrant for sure. But one thing that I want to focus on here is the kind of shape of the light, of the highlights, I should say, sorry. You see that the shape of the highlight feels quite irregular here, okay? Even this one. Because the surface is going to be irregular. If we go on the gold further, you see that the shape on the polished gold, the shape feels quite graphic and bold. You almost recognize the contour and shapes, the highlight. See that? It's pretty graphic. Something that we will never experience in something like that. Or maybe in some cases we could, but the majority will be irregular shapes for the highlight. So in terms of when you're painting that highlight, it will be easier, of course, if you paint, in case of a polished gold, with a graphic, bold approach, depending on the kind of a shape. So if I have my shape that has, again, this kind of shape here, and I have this part being exposed to the light, this part will be completely in the light, and I will see actually in a graphic way what is happening with my highlight over there. Everything will be clean and on point, bold and graphic, and we can recognize what's going on with the actual surface, right? And then when you actually paint something that feels more rough and feels like more aged gold, then your shape of the highlight should not be displayed as something that is more, I'm going to go more like this, bold and graphic like that. But even if you try to use a texture brush for creating the irregular shape, it will be something more like this. So creating and having more irregular kind of a transition in between the highlight and the big color or original color of the aged gold over there. Does it make sense? Even here, you could actually place a little bit more of irregular shape for the highlight. Does it make sense what I'm saying? Do you have any concern, question? Because I do have a couple more things to show you and to talk about. Let me know, guys. Seems like it's all good. Cool. Let's move on. I want to show you like this quick study that I was doing of this armor thing. And now I want to introduce, I think I did it already, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of the underpainting. What I mean by underpainting is the initial color that you use for starting a painting. In this case, could be this armor over there. And if I remove every information here, we just have this color that is filling the canvas basically. And why I've chosen to use this color as a starting point. The main reason is since my armor, it is mostly a neutral color. So it is mostly something that goes in this territory, right? How can I actually push more the contrast later on if I have something that is more on the grayish? And more than grayish, it's maybe reflecting colors that could be sky colors or colors that are going to be more cooler or neutral, of course. Well, I will start with something that is more on the saturated territory. Even if it's not highly saturated, like if it's not something like this, which could be too strong, maybe too much in terms of the color, but something that goes more in that territory. In fact, it goes more on this side of the chart. So that later, when I'm going to be adding more basically to reflections and neutral color of the armor, they will be in contrast. Even with a few strokes, they will be already in contrast with the and surrounding environment. Okay, it doesn't need to show too much of the rendering to understand what kind of reflections am I portraying. Because again, still in this case, neutral color, just the only color changes they're going to be seeing are the reflections of the surrounding being casted over the armor. And if you start with one moment, where is this? If you start by painting any part of this armor without the underpainting, it could be like parts, the helmet over there, without the kind of initial color contrast. And if I use the gray color here, we can still work and make it in a way for understanding what's happening here. I can paint the reflections. I can go from there, But you notice that it's still lacking some contrast because I am actually working gray color over gray color. So it is not like appropriate. And it's not like a good starting to do that. Right? And again, we can make it. I'm not saying that you cannot make with this way. Because even here, I'm starting from the gray color. I'm just saying that you will be having lacking of other colors happening here. And everything will feel a little bit dull and also, again, lacking some vivid colors here and there. So if you, instead of doing this, right, you start by, let's do this again. You start by applying something like this. Do this one as well. Maybe a little bit more desaturated because that could be a little bit too much. If you start from something like this, and then later on, you start applying, maybe we can do this for the sake of not. And then you start applying your, let's say, initial shapes. Sorry for doing this and wasting time, but I really wanted to show you this. You start by giving already some color in the background, and then you get your initial shapes, okay? And then you start applying the shadows of the helmet over there. And then you can already put some of the gray color of the helmet. Then you see that it's already pushing the contrast quite a lot. Why this is happening? This is basically happening because of the contrast that we actually have with the background. So you see how much important it is to use like a underpainting process and color that we can actually use as a starting point for creating the contrast of our armor, because this is neutral. And since this is neutral, we can actually have a cool contrast by having those kind of color relationship working at the beginning. Okay? Then we can actually place the skin over there, the face. And even when the skin is working, because you know I'm placing more neutral colors for the skin. So it is actually it is actually working in coordination with the underpainting, because I am actually putting, you know, contrast with the colors over there. Does it make sense, guys, what I'm saying? This is going to be a huge help in terms of your painting with the underpainting over there, because it really helps you creating that kind of contrast. Any question? I guess it's all good. And then you see that the highlight is actually working pretty well, because we are actually having that kind of a contrast, initial contrast with the, as I mentioned, with the background. Sorry, with the underpainting, sorry. All right. I want to move on because there is something more that I want to talk about. and it's more like a digression right now, but I think it's worth talking about it. So, any question about what we said so far, guys? I think you're kind of quiet, but maybe you get it. And yeah, let's do this digression. So, we spoke about metal being a hard surface mostly and so on, but you can actually experience certain situations where metal is going to be more liquefied, like mercury or gallium. Those are types of metal that are actually more liquefied. But even in a situation like that, you can see that the shape of the metal is going to be dictating the kind of a distortion of the material, reflections over the material. Just look at the camera here, how much distorted, or even the face, how much distorted it looks like, or even this frame here. So it basically means that you have to keep in mind your shapes and analyze them in order to understand how they are actually affecting the reflections and how the reflections are going to be appearing over the surface. And you can see those things being applied also in video games and movies, like with this Slim High from Zelda game. You can actually see that the entire room and chamber is going to be reflected over the surface of this enemy here. So it's something that if you have to do from imagination, you have to keep in mind how to deal with those reflections. Or even like this example, if you have a movie where there's a guy being made of liquefied metal, or his body could be turning into liquefied, and you still want to make it feel like there's some kind of a cloth, you have to know how to make those shapes working with the shadows and the light in order to give that illusion. Even the face, you see the planes. So you have to understand how the light is going to be reacting and how affecting the surface, and how the reflections are going to be applied over the surface as well. Okay? And also keep in mind that you have to do a lot of research, because without searching, without experiencing those things, you cannot come out with those ideas about how can I actually push my character, or how can I make this work if I have, let's say, to do something out of ordinary, something that feels like it's made of a material, but applied to some kind of a circumstances that are not like possible. Like again, a person made of metal or slime, enemies, and oops. I want to bring this, and sorry, apologize if there is any vegetarian here. I want to show you this example. Again, this is going to be a little bit of a digression, but I hope it's going to be helpful, because I really want you to get in the kind of thinking that searching is actually a good thing, and involving time to collect and create your visual library is something that if you're a designer, you should be doing, because it's helping you out with getting ideas and developing ideas more quickly. Okay. So I wanted to show you this mineral named rhodochrosite. which is actually in terms of the pattern. And again, this is a mineral, not so different from meat. You can actually see back in here, or even a tuna fish. In terms of the pattern and the kind of color, not so different from this mineral, right? So in nature, you can find stuff that is actually mimicking and also repeating in terms of pattern. And that's why it's so important for us to do research, because it will stimulate the fantasy and stimulate the kind of ideas again that we can come up with. And one day I was playing, when I have time, I try to play games. And I was actually playing this game for a Nintendo Switch named Master Chain. And basically in that game, there's an alternative world where you can actually see like weird shaped rocks, minerals, but it is actually in the story, it is actually alternative reality. And I was asking myself, wait a minute, I saw already those shapes and the color of those, because I was already collecting, in that time I was collecting, reference of minerals for a project. So I was kinda curious about searching, right? And when I experienced this game, I actually saw like those things, those sort of minerals, and say, wait a minute, I've seen that before. So I went through my folder of mineral references, and I found this mineral that I think, I don't remember the name, I apologize for that. But this is a real mineral existing. And just look at the shapes. It doesn't look so different from something like that, right? It looks quite similar. So I have to suspect that maybe the artists who worked this game, they were looking at references from real life for creating something that should be feeling out of ordinary. Now, can you make something out of ordinary if not by experiencing something that already exists, but pushing the idea of taking it and making it work with something that it's unusual, right? Because this feels unusual. This feels like it comes from another planet, but it doesn't. So that's why it's so important again to make research and to experience stuff, because maybe you can find something interesting and come up with ideas that you will not do normally. The last example will be here, still in the metal surface, the Damascus steel. And at the time, I was actually making like a character with different knives. And in the script, it was said that this guy has a special knife, and that knife must be different from all the other knives. Okay. And I was thinking, okay, I can play with the hilt of it. So I can play with the handle, like making something more particular, but it wasn't enough. And I was saying, how can I push it? I did some research and I found this Damascus steel, which is a steel that is manufactured and made by artisan, that they were actually able to create that kind of a pattern, in the process of making that steel. And the cool thing is that you see what kind of pattern and the cool pattern it's actually making. So this could be something that can feel different, can feel unique, and can feel special. And I was using this as reference for creating that kind of a thing that should be feeling completely different from normal knives. Okay. So again, the power of reference, how much in research, how much is important to stimulate your creativity. Now, closing this digression, I want to go back and before stopping here and taking a break, I want to show you those examples from old master painters. And now I want to ask you, in terms of, you see that there is armor here, so there's metal, okay? We're going to be studying those for sure, and I'm going to be giving you as an assignment to study from old master paintings, having displaying metal for sure. But before doing that, I want to ask you one thing. How those artists, how they were being able to create the contrast in between the materials. And where do you see the kind of a hierarchy? And what I mean by hierarchy is the importance in terms of the treatment of the light in the kind of a materials, how they were being working. Okay, can you notice in those two examples what kind of hierarchy they made for creating the contrast in between the materials? And if so, could you let me know and explain what things and what elements they pushed in those exact elements, so materials, in order to increase that contrast and hierarchy of materials? Anyone? No? Come on, guys, you can make it.
Could it be like, well, value contrast and edge treatment? Those are the only two things I can think of.
Value contrast of what?
Yeah, on the armor for the lighting, and then edge treatments
Okay.
for the softness of, let's say, the difference of texture from the, let's say, the horse's fur, I guess, compared to the metal plates. I feel there's like a difference in the harshness of the, well, not the strokes, but the edge treatment. Did that
No,
make
no, I
any
get
sense?
it. No, I get it. Where you are basically saying that the way the artists render, and by the way, for this one should be Van Dyke. I do remember the artist who made this one. The treatment of the fur, which is of course different from any metal pieces that is actually on the other parts, and also of the armor. I have to say that's correct. But I also want to address one thing. The overall consideration you made, it's correct. So it's more on the hierarchy of the contrast of the lighting and the values. Like, what's the most, I want to say, what is the material in those two paintings that is higher in the contrast of lighting? Of course, it's going to be the metal. And then there's going to be the skin, and then there's going to be the fur. There is some kind of a hierarchy, right? And that hierarchy, it is important for creating the contrast, because all the images, how can we make a material believable? By actually making the material in contrast. In fact, if I do that, and I hope Van Dyke will forgive me, if I add some kind of a highlight here in the nose, and generally speaking on the face, but even on the skin, you see that the result will be this sort of a porcelain effect, which cannot be appropriate. We should not be appropriate for the skin, right? Because the skin will be feeling much more softer, and rounder in the transition of the values, but not so reflective in the highlight because it will feel glossy. Neither with the hair, it won't be looking good, neither correctly, right? The only part where you can actually use, and you did, the usage of the highlight is on the eyes, because the eyes, you know, since they are wet, they're constantly wet, you will actually see more reflectivity on the surface, more like this glossy kind of effect, but not in the skin. So be aware about that, because usually also you see sometimes online, there are artists who are painting, you know, the skin in a way that feels like that. And I don't think it's 100% appropriate. There could be cases where you can actually push the skin more in a wet kind of a territory. But especially if you have more materials, including metal or materials that are even more reflective than skin, why should you be applying, you know, the same reflectivity if the materials should be in contrast, right? It could be, for example, on the color a little bit, because this kind of a silk material, the silk cloth, here could be showing some reflections. But even in that kind of a thing, you cannot go as far as with the metal over there. So you have to establish a kind of a hierarchy in between your materials. And this, you should be carrying on with this from the start to the end, with this kind of a hierarchy in terms of considering the shadows and the lighting, and then with the values, how much can I push it? Or how much should they go more in contrast with them? Same thing in this preference. The face doesn't have any trace of white, pure white kind of value here, but the armor has, because the armor can go higher with the value chart and can go highly reflective because it's the property of the material that it's making that. And that's why we have to study, you know, from reference, but even from those old masters, because they were solving this problem about how to make something believable by the contrast of the materials, of course. Okay, does it make sense? Last thing will be, I want to show you this from another artist that I like, an old master painter, which is Menzel. And you see here is doing the kind of a thing that I was explaining you before with the underpainting. So he was doing this study of those armors. And those studies, you can see that it started with this color in the background, which is this sort of a saturated kind of orange color like this. And then he painted basically the reflections of the armor, and that's it. But you see that it's so effective, even without spending so much time into applying layers of color. It's more in the relationship of the saturated underpainting color and the desaturated colors of the armor. Okay? So, if there is any question, I will take a break and I will create the assignment for you, which will be, first of all, studying an old master painting or studying from reference. Both will be perfect. You can do both. And then the second part of the assignment would be to apply what you learned onto something like from your imagination or from your design. If you want to use the silhouette that I shared before, you can use that, whatever. I just wanted to add more complexity now because we are now adding another material which has different lighting properties than the materials that we talk about so far. And I want to see you applying at least 2 materials, or 3 will be best, like having, like in this case, metal, skin, and a matte surface or something that feels maybe translucent as well. I'll leave this up to you. But I would love to see many materials in the same, can be character, can be prop, can be environment, whatever. I just want to see the contrast and how you manage the hierarchy of those materials and how you make them feel believable. Does it sound too complex, or it's fine? Do you accept the challenge?
Yeah, it's fine.
Ooh. All right. Let's take a break then. And in the meantime, I'll create the assignment, and right after, I'll start giving you some feedback. See you in a little bit.